Everyone thinks Luka Dončić is a lock for MVP this upcoming NBA season, but what if I told you that he might not even crack the top 3 this upcoming season? Let me explain to you why the odds are so stacked against him, and it might not be what you think it is. Anyway, let's get into it right after this intro. All right, guys, so of course, the MVP conversation when it comes to Luka Dončić is a very controversial one, is a very, very hot topic in Dallas and probably in parts of the NBA. But this upcoming season, there's going to be more BS than you've ever thought you could have heard last season. We're talking about the man almost averaged 35, 10, and 10 the previous season and was barely a top 3 MVP candidate, which is completely insane and disrespectful to the history, the legacy of the NBA, to have someone to have such a season that he had, for it to historically just go out on the whimper like it did and be top 3. Now, with all that being said, I'm gonna go into the specific reasons why there's going to be a no Luka MVP season this upcoming year. I'm gonna give you several reasons. I'm going to break down why the national media might be influenced to do so and be against Luka Dončić in his MVP campaign. We're going to talk about all of the narratives that they utilize for him. We're going to talk about the groupthink that some people from ESPN come up with and influence the vote. There's so many things that go into who is the MVP of any season. But Luka should be on the cusp of going into this next season and potentially getting his 3rd MVP, where we're here discussing that he's going to go into another season where he should be MVP and will most likely not get one. And now we're talking about 3 MVP seasons that he has had and did not get the MVP nod. So let's get straight into all of this stuff, and then at the end I'll share to you why there is some glimmer of hope that he might win the MVP. Let's go ahead and let's get started. All right, so here's the number one reason that you see in certain pockets of the national media. They always talk about team success and playoff seeding being a big factor for Luka Dončić's MVP candidacy, right? And the thing about that is, it's like, okay, it works against Luka, but it doesn't work against anyone else. There's obviously several examples where playoff seeding and playoffs or season success didn't really matter as to who was MVP when it comes to Russell Westbrook or Nikola Jokic. Now, we can really get into those specific things and point out as to why those MVPs, they didn't really deserve it, specifically the Jokic one over Luka Dončić, and we can really talk about Russ. I mean, that conversation's been had quite a bit. But that is going to be one of the biggest outliers, one of the biggest reasons that the national media will hold on to as to why someone doesn't deserve an MVP. That is what they did to Luka in 2022. That is what they did to Luka in 2024. However, in 2022, Jokic was the beneficiary of that season where his team was in the 6th spot, where his team was injured, and all this quote-unquote reasons as to why he should be MVP. Whereas Luka Dončić in 2022, if you remember, he finished 4th with a roster where everyone criticized that roster, saying they are not good enough, that he carried a bum roster. But that roster at the time was 4th in the West. So when people in national media pundits were like, who else is it? Just Luka and that's it. But he did not get the credit or the recognition that he deserved that season, whereas opposed to Jokic was 6th with a bum squad too because of injuries, and he got the MVP nod. So revisionist history, people look back and like, no, that Mavericks roster had Jalen Brunson and Kristaps Porzingis and all this, but that was not the Jalen Brunson that he is now. That was not the Kristaps Porzingis that he is now. These players were underperforming, and Luka Dončić was literally carrying that team on a whole different level. They want the players to go through such a hard route to become MVP instead of just giving the player the MVP. I mean, I understand the advanced analytics. I've never heard of advanced analytics being a reason to select MVP, but there you have it. Team success and playoff seeding only pertains to an MVP candidacy depending on how the national media look at it, and then whether that is going to garner, ratings from Eastern Europe or whatever the case may be. There are so many things behind why they go through these loopholes into who deserves MVP and who doesn't. It's just weird, but that is one of the main topics that they will talk about this upcoming season for Luka Dončić. Now, Luka Dončić is a top 3 team. I guarantee you, whoever's second or first, they will outweigh Luka's candidacy if he is not a top seed in the West. So we can talk about another reason as to why the national media and people in general will not give Luka Dončić the recognition or even the nod for becoming an MVP this upcoming season. We can talk about narrative fatigue and emerging NBA superstars. Yes, Luka Dončić has been in the league since 2018 now. He is now somewhat of a household name, and not as an emerging superstar. He is already a superstar, and maybe there is voter fatigue on Luka, who never had a championship or never had an MVP. But here you have Anthony Edwards on the rise. You got Shai Gilgeous, even though he's been in the league longer than Luka, he doesn't have the voter fatigue that Luka does. And then you got Victor Wembanyama. These players and these stars are fresher to the majority of the public, the general viewing public. So I already see that they're going to be pushing Anthony Edwards. They're going to be pushing Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. They're going to be pushing Wemby. If Wemby gets you a top 8, top 7 seed, I guarantee you he's going to get plenty of MVP votes. If Anthony Edwards gets a top seed, a number 1 seed, I guarantee you he's going to get a lot of MVP votes. Same thing with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. That's why it is important for the Dallas Mavericks, if they want Luka to get his MVP, he not only has to be the first seed in the West, but on top of that, he has to outshine the emerging stars and become like a brand new superstar to the general public in a different way. It is just the list and basically the route to become an MVP for Luka Dončić is so the hole is so deep. He has to claw his way out just to even be considered. It's absolutely insane. Yes, absolutely insane. Let's get into the third reason. The third reason I'm going to talk about Luka Dončić being a defensive liability. That narrative is so tiresome. We could talk about defensive rating here and there. The man has improved his defensive capabilities. It's not like Anthony Edwards was shutting him down when Luka was hurt. It's not like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was shutting him down. If I recall correctly, Luka blocked Shai Gilgeous-Alexander at the end of one of those games in the playoffs. Regardless of the fact, they created a brand new stat for Luka Dončić in the playoffs. They refer to it as the blown by percentage. Never in my life have I ever heard this. But whenever the national media saw him have a bit of an outburst, a little bit of a tantrum in the NBA Finals, they went so heavy at him. Especially Brian Windhorst with the heaviest take. They went after Luka Dončić. They waited for this one moment to finally find some kind of issue in his armor to go off on him and embarrass him. They didn't come up with this blown by percentage, and I'm like, where's the blown by percentage for all these other players? But they will die on that hill that Luka Dončić is just a one-way player, that he is a defensive liability, and that is what is going to take away from his NBA candidacy. There you have it. That's part of what this national media does, is they do not want Luka Dončić ever to hoist that MVP trophy. Let's get into my fourth reason. All right, so the fourth reason is the groupthink mentality inside of the media. And I'm specifically referring to Tim Bontemps of ESPN. The man has a early poll, a mid poll, a final poll for MVP. And this poll that he creates has so much influence on who becomes the MVP. It is outright disgusting. If you hear him talk about how they go about selecting MVPs, he talks about having a top season and they utilize the previous season to gauge how this player is going to be viewed upon on the next season. So he was saying if Luka has a great playoff run, then the next season, as long as he's, top 5 or top 3 in the West, he could be considered for MVP. Although the man was averaging 35, damn near 10 and 10, and was a top 5 seed, he barely had any consideration and was only about 6 games away from Denver. So they only had a 6-game difference between him and Jokic. So they made it seem like the gap was that much when it really wasn't that much. Tim Bontemps and the way they look at voting for MVP, it is such a backwards way of looking at it. It removes the ability to assess basketball in its current form. And the way they look at it is so like this, we're the leader of selecting MVP. This is how we gauge it. It's got to be this, and this, and this. But on certain years, we'll change it to this and this and this and this. They have full control versus who is going to be MVP or not. You look at the Joel Embiid and Jokic season. That was what that became. And you look at the Jokic 2022 season. You saw what that became. They are based on narratives, storylines, instead of what is being played in front of you, and that is basketball. And Luka Dončić, for the season that he had in 2023-24, was 1,000% the MVP season. As you saw, he made the NBA Finals. None of those other MVP candidates made it. They didn't. The other two didn't even make the Western Conference Finals, but Luka Dončić did. And the sad thing about it is Tim Bontemps and ESPN and all of these, media personalities have so much influence on influencing the actual voters to this that it just throws a huge wrench into the season, because midway through it, when you see them all leaning on one player, you're like, well, then damn, this other player that is right there within a few games of him is not even being considered for an MVP when he's overlapping him by 8 points in the scoring department. He's right there in assists with him. He's a few rebounds away from being in there, but he is leading his team on a second half burner. Like, the way the Mavericks close the season should have told you everything as far as how they close the season. And I get it. They always talk about Luka and these slow starts, these slow beginnings to the year, whatever the case may be. And they utilize what happened in the beginning of the year and they hold it against them the whole season, which is insane. Because there's been teams that finished 6th, that finished 8th. They didn't have a hot start and they didn't finish hot, but just because they had a tough team and had these historic numbers, they get the nod. Luka had a decent and great team and historic numbers and didn't even sniff an MVP. So the groupthink mentality, to where these personalities, majority of them, talk basketball, but it's like they don't know basketball, is what is plaguing the league and determining the actual true MVP to the league. So that's where I say the league needs to find a better way, better categories, better reasons, and better structure to come up with the MVP moving forward. And that's part of another assessment as to why the Dallas Mavericks are going to have a hard time convincing the league as to why Luka Dončić should be MVP. Last but not least, voter fatigue. We'll leave it there. Voter fatigue for Luka Dončić. They don't even want to vote for this man, regardless of how it is, whether he's performing great during the season and then he throws a dud in the All-Star game. Voter fatigue has happened to someone that has never won anything, which is completely insane. And then you have Jokic winning 3 out of the last 4, 2 of which he robbed Luka from. The NBA is going to find a way to rob Luka. Now, there is a few ways for the Mavericks to avoid this and allow Luka to be even considered for MVP. And we're going to get into that right now. The way the Mavericks could get an MVP for Luka Dončić is you have to finish first in the West, probably have the best record in the league. Luka Dončić numbers, unfortunately, if they even take a dip, that might be something they hold against him. If he is somewhere around 28, 10, and 13, where he has a bump in assist and his points come down a little bit because he has a way better team, they might find a way to use that against him. Like, oh, well, they didn't have to use him much. He has a better team. He has Klay Thompson now. He has Spencer Dinwiddie as a backup. He's not playing 40 minutes a game. He's playing 34. Like, they will find every single excuse and reason to not give it to Luka Dončić, because I guarantee you the NBA and all the national media pundits want to give this MVP to Anthony Edwards or Shai Gilgeous-Alexander or Victor Wembanyama. That is who they want this MVP to go to. Luka Dončić is not who they wanted to go to. Possibly because of Slovenia, small country. Possibly because Luka Dončić might not have a big reach as much as Nikola Jokic. There's so many politics that go behind who's MVP and who's not. And the only way for the Dallas Mavericks to be able to ensure that Luka does get that MVP is he cannot have that big of a drop off from last year as far as his statistics are concerned, which might happen. He has to finish first in the West, which could happen, and they have to have some kind of cool narrative going on in the season. Luka has to have a cool storyline going on in the season. You have to meet all these criterias to become an MVP, which is completely stupid when it should just be based on how the player has played with relation to some team success. And in Luka's case, there's been 2 opportunities where he should have been MVP. Anyway, man, it's been your boy TGK, man. Y'all let me know in the comments if you think there's other reasons as to why they won't give Luka Dončić his MVP. Let me know what you think. Also, let's get this video 1 million likes and 1 million views. It's been your boy TGK. Catch y'all on the next one.